The fluorescent lights hummed like a generator that would never stop running. Elena Martinez had been at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, not that she was counting, and the trauma bay was the only place where her hands didn't shake. Her left hand tremored in the break room, in the parking lot, in the shower at 3 in the morning, but the moment she touched a patient, muscle memory took over. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 3 years of Kandahar combat medicine lived in her fingertips, and she kept those years locked down so tight that nobody at Sacred Heart would ever guess what she'd been. She was invisible. That was the entire point. The scrubs hung loose on a frame that had lost 15 pounds since her voluntary separation from the Coast Guard 6 months ago. The scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, and they smelled of industrial bleach and something else, antiseptic, the kind that was supposed to make you feel safe but just made Elena feel like she was breathing sterilized air in a place where people came to break. She'd chosen this hospital because it was busy enough to disappear in, small enough that nobody asked questions, and far enough from the 7th District Command Center that she'd never run into anyone who knew Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. Nobody knew that rank. Nobody knew the medals in a box in her apartment closet: Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, all of them still in their presentation cases, untouched since she'd signed the separation papers. Nobody at Sacred Heart knew anything about her past. That was the deal she'd made with herself, anonymity in exchange for survival. Not the kind of survival where you stayed alive. The kind where you didn't have to wake up screaming about the sound of mortars or the weight of a soldier who'd bled out in your arms despite everything you did to stop it. The night shift was quieter than days. Fewer administrators, fewer meetings, fewer people who wanted to chat by the coffee station. Elena preferred it that way. She moved through the trauma bay like she was moving through a FOB, forward operating base, checking the supply cart in the exact sequence she'd learned during her first deployment: airway supplies first, top shelf, hemorrhage control second, for access third, medications arranged by dose and delivery method. 3-point anchor methodology. It was a system she'd developed in Kandahar when speed was the difference between a soldier living and a soldier becoming a statistic. She hadn't thought about changing it. It was good. It worked. Nobody seemed to notice that a trauma nurse's supply check didn't follow the hospital's published protocol. The antiseptic smell was cleaner than cordite. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the distance. Someone was on life support in bed for, and Elena registered the sound without really hearing it anymore. Sounds like that had become background noise, like the wind outside, like her own heartbeat. What she noticed was the way the blood pressure monitor's numbers climbed when a patient's pain spiked, the way a pupil dilated when intracranial pressure was rising, the way a patient's breathing pattern changed when they were about to crash. Those were the sounds that mattered. Those were the sounds that meant you had maybe 90 seconds to do something or someone was going to die. She'd held a lot of people while they died. She was trying very hard not to hold anyone else. The cold steel of the crash cart was smoother than a rifle. She pushed it into position at 11:56 p.m. on a Wednesday, checking the defibrillator pads, verifying the drug doses were within expiration date, epinephrine, atropine, amiodarone, and confirming the oxygen concentrator was delivering clean gas. The ritual of it was meditative. The precision of it was prayer. Her hands moved through the motions like a liturgy she'd memorized in a language most people wouldn't understand. Efficient, a voice said behind her. Elena didn't turn. She knew without looking that it was Dr. Sterling. He'd been arriving at Sacred Heart for approximately 6 weeks, and in that time he'd become the kind of doctor who wore his credentials like a weapon. Ivy League undergraduate, top-tier medical school, fellowship in something that required a Latin name and a 6-figure salary. The way he moved through the hospital was the way a man moved through spaces where he expected people to defer. He wore shoes that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. His stethoscope was a brand she'd only ever seen in catalogs. Everything about Dr. Sterling announced that he was the kind of person who didn't have questions about his own importance. Elena finished checking the crash cart. She didn't hurry. She didn't acknowledge him. Acknowledgement meant conversation, and conversation meant eye contact, and eye contact meant the possibility that he might see something in her face that she didn't want him to see. She'd gotten very good at being invisible. It was a skill that translated well from the military. Keep your head down. Do your job. Don't draw attention. Make yourself so small that nobody remembers you were ever there. You've been here 3 months, Dr. Sterling said. He was still standing there, still watching her. Not many people last that long in the trauma bay. Especially not women. Especially not when they look like they're carrying something. Elena's jaw clenched. Just slightly. Just enough that her teeth pressed together hard enough to hurt. She pulled the drawer on the crash cart closed and locked it with a soft click that sounded like the safety on a rifle being engaged. When she turned to face him, her expression was blank. It was the expression she'd perfected in briefing rooms with Pentagon officials who wanted to hear stories about her service and soldiers who wanted to ask her if she was scared. She'd perfected the blank look so well that even her sister didn't recognize it anymore. Even her sister had stopped calling after the 3rd time Elena didn't pick up. Just vigilant, Elena said. 10 words. She'd learned to keep her sentences short, her voice level, her tone professional in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. Patient safety requires attention to detail. Dr. Sterling smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd just found something interesting to observe, the way a scientist might smile at a new specimen. My apologies. I didn't mean to intrude. You just move like you know exactly what you're doing. Most nurses learn by protocol. You move like you learn by necessity. Elena turned back to the supplies. She didn't respond. She'd learned in Kandahar that the best answer to observation was silence. Silence didn't defend anything. Silence didn't explain anything. Silence just let people draw their own conclusions, and most people concluded that if you weren't defending yourself, there was nothing worth attacking. The night shift stretched out in front of her like a runway. 12 hours. 720 minutes. 43,200 seconds of staying invisible. She could manage that. She'd managed worse. She'd managed Sanjin Valley in the summer when the temperature climbed to 119 degrees and the insurgent activity climbed right alongside it. She'd managed standing in a trauma bay in Kandahar with blood running down her gloved hands and incoming fire crackling outside the perimeter. She could manage Dr. Sterling's observation and the slight, calculating way he was looking at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way her hands moved through the supply cart with the exact precision of a tactical medic's loadout check. The worst part was that she'd arranged the defibrillator pads in the 3-point anchor configuration that nobody taught in American nursing school. The worst part was that muscle memory was a language her body spoke fluently, and eventually, someone smart enough to understand that language would ask questions she didn't want to answer. She worked the rest of the shift without incident. 2 cases came through the trauma bay, a motor vehicle accident at 1:34 a.m. and a construction injury at 4:12 a.m., and Elena moved through both with the kind of calm efficiency that made everything look effortless. The motor vehicle accident was stable. The construction injury required sutures, antibiotic ointment, and a tetanus booster. Neither case required anything beyond standard protocol. Neither case required her to use any of the skills that lived in the muscle memory that Dr. Sterling had noticed. At 6:13 a.m., as the day shift was starting to arrive and the fluorescent light seemed to hum louder as if celebrating the approaching end of night, Elena went to the break room. She sat at the plastic table that was sticky with old coffee and opened her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 in the morning, turkey and mustard on whole wheat, nothing fancy. She pulled out her jacket from the locker. The jacket was old. It was the kind of jacket that had been washed so many times it had lost most of its color. It was navy blue, like the scrubs, like everything else she wore, like she was trying to disappear into a uniform even now. Her fingers found the seam where she'd sewn the unit patch inside the lining. The patch was faded. It was the only piece of her past she'd kept close. The patch was maybe 2 inches by 2 inches, embroidered with an anchor and a date and the coordinates of the FOB where she'd spent 6 months of her life. The embroidery was coming loose in one corner. She'd been meaning to restitch it for weeks. Her finger traced the loose thread. Pain was information. That's what they'd taught her. Pain meant something was wrong. Pain meant you needed to stop and assess and figure out what was breaking. The loose thread was just a thread. The loose thread didn't mean anything. But the loose thread was connected to the patch, and the patch was connected to every person she'd treated in Kandahar, and every person she'd treated was connected to the decision she'd made 6 months ago to walk away from the Coast Guard and into the anonymous darkness of Sacred Heart Hospital, where nobody knew who she was and nobody ever asked. Elena put the jacket back in her locker. She finished her sandwich. She clocked out at 7:15 a.m. and walked to the parking lot where her 2008 Honda CR-V was parked in the same spot it occupied every day. The rain had started sometime during her shift, Denver rain, thin and cold, the kind that made everything smell like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. She sat in the car for a moment without starting the engine. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. For just a moment, before she got home and before she tried to sleep and before the nightmare started, her hands didn't shake. But that was the problem with invisibility. It couldn't last forever. Eventually, someone always saw through it. Eventually, someone always asked the questions that made you have to tell the truth. And the truth about Elena Martinez was something she'd spent 6 months trying to bury so deep that even she couldn't find it anymore. She started the car. The engine made its familiar sound, not like a Black Hawk rotor, not like anything that would trigger the alert response she'd been trained to develop. Just a regular engine. A civilian sound. A sound that belonged to a regular person living a regular life. Elena drove home through the Denver dawn, and nobody who saw her would have known that she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a nurse, tired from a night shift, heading home for sleep. They wouldn't have known about the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining. They wouldn't have known about the combat action ribbon folded in her apartment closet. They wouldn't have known that Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez was the kind of person who could hold a person together while mortar fire crashed down around her and could do it again tomorrow if she had to. They wouldn't have known because she'd made herself invisible. And that invisibility was the most dangerous thing at Sacred Heart Hospital. Because invisibility meant nobody was watching when she moved. Invisibility meant nobody noticed the precision. Invisibility meant that when the real crisis came, the one that would change everything, nobody would be ready for what a woman who'd learned medicine in Kandahar could actually do. The staff lounge at Sacred Heart smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. Dr. Sterling sat on the edge of the break room table during morning rounds, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire surgical team to hear. "I'll give her a week," he announced, eyes scanning the room like he was addressing a board meeting instead of tired nurses refilling their cups. "These burnt-out military types never last. Mark my calendar." The other physicians exchanged glances. Some smiled. Some looked away. Elena stood by the refrigerator, her hand frozen on a cold coffee cup she'd brewed at 5 in the morning. She'd never mentioned her past. Not to anyone at Sacred Heart. Not to her sister. Not to the background investigator who'd called 3 months ago, when she'd taken the job under a name that felt like wearing someone else's skin. She said nothing. She never did. She finished her coffee in silence and clocked in at 6:47. 2 days later, the cafeteria line moved like a river during lunch rush. Elena carried her tray with the same precision she'd carried equipment bags through mountain passes, balanced, efficient, invisible. She was halfway to the nurse's table when Dr. Sterling emerged from the hot line, his eyes already searching for an audience. The moment he saw her, something shifted in his expression. A predator recognizing prey that wouldn't fight back. He walked directly into her path. Elena saw it coming. The slight angle of his shoulder. The way his gaze fixed on her tray. She had time to brace, time to turn, time to move. She did none of those things. She stood there with 30 staff members watching as Dr. Sterling's arm swung up and knocked the tray clean out of her hands. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed across the cafeteria like a gunshot in a quiet room. Chicken soup cascaded across white tile. Crackers scattered like shrapnel. Her sandwich slid 3 feet across the floor. Clumsy, Sterling said, his voice cutting through the silence that had fallen over the room. Maybe nursing isn't your speed, sweetheart. He stepped over the wreckage and continued to his table like he'd just ordered a drink. Elena took one measured breath. Then she felt it, that single tear, the one that always escaped in the moment her body realized the threat was real. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the room full of people who were waiting to see if she would break. She didn't. She knelt down, her scrubs brushing against spilled soup, and began to clean the mess with her bare hands. She worked methodically, gathering each piece of ceramic, each cracker, methodically stacking them on the corner of a tray. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical rhythm. No one offered to help. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft scrape of her hands against tile and the distant beeping of monitors from the cardiac ward 2 floors above. When she stood, her hands were steady. Perfectly steady. The kind of steady that comes from having held a man's chest cavity open in a forward operating base while rounds impacted the walls 3 feet away. The kind of steady that comes from knowing that trembling means someone dies. But that was information Sterling would never have. That was a story that lived only inside the jacket lining of her locker, where a faded unit patch still smelled like salt water and sacrifice. She discarded the broken tray and walked back to the cafeteria line to get a new meal. Several physicians watched her. One of them, Dr. Reeves from Trauma, looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. That was the culture of Sacred Heart. That was the culture of most hospitals. You watched the bullying happen and you went back to your sandwich. That afternoon, during rounds, Sterling made his final move. Elena was presenting vitals for a post-op patient in the trauma wing when Dr. Sterling approached from the nurses' station. The surgical team, 6 attending physicians, 4 residents, a medical student, stood in a loose semicircle, reviewing charts. Sterling pulled a patient file off the desk and held it for exactly 1 second before releasing it. The pages spiraled through the air and landed at Elena's feet, scattering across the linoleum like someone had just dumped out a file cabinet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil. "Since you're so good at cleaning up messes." He smiled at the attending physicians like they were sharing an inside joke. A few shifted uncomfortably. One actually looked down at his shoes. The medical student, a kid who couldn't have been more than 23, seemed to be holding his breath. Elena bent down. She gathered each page with steady hands. Single sheets, folded pages, labs results, vital signs from the past 48 hours. She organized them as she picked them up, putting them back in order, creating a neat stack. The motion was automatic. The precision was muscle memory from 7 years of field organization, from trauma bags that needed to be sorted by priority in the dark. When she stood, she held the file at chest level. She looked directly at Sterling, and something shifted in the room. The fluorescent light seemed to dim. The monitor beeping from nearby bed sounded suddenly very far away. The other physicians were absolutely motionless. "I've steadied my hands through mortar fire, Doctor," Elena said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It simply stated a fact, the way a person might say the sky is blue or that Tuesday comes after Monday. Your theatrics don't register. She placed the file on the nearest desk and turned back to her patient presentation without waiting for a response. Sterling's smile faltered. Just for a second. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed like he'd been slapped and was still processing the impact. He opened his mouth and then closed it. The attending physicians suddenly became very interested in their charts. Someone coughed. The resident next to Elena took a small step away from her, as if proximity might transfer whatever had just happened. Sterling walked away without a word. But not before Elena caught the expression crossing his face, the look of a man who had just realized, for the first time, that the woman he'd been targeting might not be quite as defenseless as he'd assumed. The rounds continued. Vitals were discussed. Medications were ordered. The machinery of the hospital continued its steady hum. But something had changed in the room, in the careful balance of power that Sterling had maintained through 3 months of escalating humiliation. Elena returned to her patient care. She checked for lines and adjusted medications and documented fluid intake with the same precision she'd documented blood losses and surgical procedures in operating theaters that didn't have names, in countries that barely appeared on the maps people used. That night, she sat on her apartment floor with the unit patch in her hands. She'd removed it from her jacket lining, something she almost never did. The fabric was faded, barely visible. The anchor sewn beneath it had lost its shine. Marcus's name, the letters she'd stitched herself in a tent in Helmand Province with a needle and thread and the kind of focus that comes from knowing you might never use it again. I've steadied my hands through mortar fire, she whispered to the patch, to the memory, to the woman she'd left behind in that desert. I can steady them here too. She didn't know that in exactly 72 hours, a man in a Coast Guard uniform would walk through the emergency department doors. She didn't know that he would see her and recognize something in the way she moved, the way she positioned for treatment, the specific three-point anchor method she'd perfected in combat zones where precision meant the difference between a soldier living to see his family again and a flag-folded box on someone's doorstep. She didn't know that he would be the trigger. The thing that would unravel everything she'd built. But that night, holding the patch in the quiet darkness of her apartment, Elena Martinez understood one thing with absolute certainty: Sterling had made a mistake. He'd assumed she was fragile because she was quiet. He'd assumed silence meant weakness. He'd never considered that the deadliest people in a room were usually the ones nobody was paying attention to. That the ones who'd learned to steadily their hands through mortar fire didn't flinch at a condescending smile or a patient chart thrown at their feet. She folded the patch carefully and placed it back inside her jacket lining, where it belonged. Where it would stay until the world discovered what it meant. The ambulance bay doors hissed open at 6:24 p.m. on Wednesday, and Elena heard the dispatch call before she saw the stretcher. Training accident. Chest trauma. Tension pneumothorax. The paramedics wheeled in a grizzled Coast Guard commander, salt-weathered face, the kind of jaw that had spent 40 years saluting into Arctic wind, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps like a man drowning on dry land. His left side was caved inward. Collapsed lung. Elena recognized it the way a musician recognizes a missed note in a symphony. The monitors screamed their electronic panic. BP 78 over 52 and dropping. Oxygen saturation 64%. Get him to trauma 3, she called, moving with the stretcher. Push 2 liters normal saline wide open. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle at the bedside. Now. The commander's eyes found hers for just 1 second, blue eyes the color of the Atlantic in winter, and something flickered there. Recognition, maybe. Or just the panic of a man whose body was betraying him. His lips moved. No sound came out. The oxygen debt was too severe. His lungs were trying to breathe against a pressure pocket that kept expanding, collapsing the good lung tissue, pushing his heart sideways in his chest. Every breath made it worse. Every breath was suffocation. Elena's hands moved on their own. Not hesitation. Not prayer. Just knowledge written into muscle memory through 16 years and 847 combat casualties in Kandahar's trauma tents. She swabbed his chest with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and clean and certain. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmark where air had no business being. Stay with me, Commander, she said quietly, and the needle went in. The hiss came immediately, that unmistakable sound of air pressure releasing, like opening a door onto a different world. His O2 saturation climbed. 67%. 71%. 78%. His breathing eased. The color returned to his lips from gray to something almost human. She threaded the catheter with the three-point anchor method she perfected in a dusty aid station while rockets fell like hail, the technique that kept chest tubes from sliding out when patients thrashed through post-traumatic confusion. Secure. Stable. Precise. The commander's hand shot up and grabbed her wrist. His grip had the strength of panic and the clarity of someone emerging from the water gasping for air. I know that technique, he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. You're a combat medic. The room had gone quiet. The other nurses froze. The resident froze. The monitors beeped in the silence like a judge's gavel, and Elena could feel every eye shift toward her, the question forming behind their pupils. Combat medic? This quiet trauma nurse who folded linen precisely and never spoke about anything beyond the 12-hour shift? She pressed one finger to her lips. Just one. Not a word. Not a shake of her head. Not a denial. Just the gesture of silence that said, "We don't speak of this, not here, not now, not ever." The commander held her gaze for 3 more seconds, and she saw him understand. She saw him recognize the chain she'd wrapped around her own past. He released her wrist. "Chest tubes in," she announced to the room, her voice returning to its careful neutral register. "Monitor continuous. I'll get him upstairs for imaging." By the next morning, the commander's initial crisis had stabilized into something else, the slow-motion disaster of complications building like clouds before a storm. Fluid was accumulating around his lungs, the kind of build-up that follows trauma, the body's confused response to injury and repair. His oxygen levels, which had climbed to a respectable 88% after the needle decompression, began their inexorable descent. 84%. 80%. 76%. Elena watched the numbers drop the way a sailor watches a barometer fall, knowing the weather was turning before the rain came. She pulled a double shift without asking. Nobody would have stopped her anyway. The trauma unit was always understaffed, and Elena was the kind of nurse who made the impossible look routine. She sat in the window seat of the supply room on her 1 30-minute break at midnight and watched the city sleep below Sacred Heart's 15th floor. The lights of Denver spread like a circuit board, and somewhere in all that darkness were people who'd never had their chests opened, never gasped for air they couldn't get, never been alone in their worst moment. She envied them for 30 seconds, then returned to work. The commander was in the ICU now, room 1512, overlooking the same city. Elena checked on him between her other patients, monitoring the chest tube output, dark serosanguineous fluid that kept coming, kept coming. His vital signs had become her ticking clock. Every 4 hours she logged numbers that told the story of a body failing in slow motion. Temperature climbing toward 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Heart rate at 118. Respiratory rate elevated. The pneumonia was coming, the kind that follows major chest trauma, the infection that moves like fog through damaged lungs. She was documenting his O200 check when she heard Dr. Sterling's voice in the hallway outside the break room. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. The door was cracked open. The hallway was quiet. His voice carried with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to project authority without raising volume. "I need you to check her credentials," he was saying into his phone. "Something doesn't add up about this one." She performed a procedure, needle decompression, without clear protocol authorization. "I need an external audit. Call Henderson, the compliance director. Tell him I'm requesting a full background check and credentials verification on Elena Martinez. Immediately." A pause. "I don't care about the time. This is a liability situation." Elena's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. She was trained for pressure the way aircraft are trained for gravity. It was simply the environment in which she operated. She finished charting the commander's vitals with the same steady hand and the same careful handwriting she'd used to document casualties in a tent where the only light came from generators powered by diesel smoke. By Wednesday evening of the second day, the commander's oxygen saturation had bottomed out at 62% despite the chest tube, despite the antibiotics, despite every intervention that should have worked. The fluid kept coming. His lungs were drowning from the inside. Elena was adjusting his oxygen delivery system at 18:43 hours when his monitor transitioned from rhythm to chaos. Ventricular fibrillation. Cardiac arrest. The alarm screamed its electronic death wail, and Elena hit the code button. Not hesitation. Not consultation. The button went red and her fingers were already moving, already compressions, already counting the compressions in her head the way soldiers count rounds. 120 per minute. The rhythmic violence of keeping a heart moving when it had forgotten how to work. Hands on the sternum. Compressions that had to be hard enough to move blood through a dying system but gentle enough to keep the ribs intact. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Repeat. Within 90 seconds, 10 physicians had entered the room. Every attending physician on shift. The surgical team. Dr. Sterling moving through the doorway like a general entering a war zone he'd already decided to abandon. Elena didn't break rhythm. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The commander's eyes had rolled back, that grey-blue gaze staring into nothing. His body was being inflated and compressed like a machine, like a tool, like something that had already been broken and was being forced back into working order by sheer force of will. The commander gasped. His eyes opened. And he screamed. The airstrike! His voice was violence itself, a sound torn up from somewhere deeper than lungs. You called it in. You called it on our position. He was thrashing now, his arms flailing against the compressions, disoriented and trapped and drowning in memory. The trauma in his chest had opened trauma in his mind, and now both were bleeding at once. Elena kept compressions. 30. Compressions. 2 breaths. Dr. Sterling stepped back. This patient is making serious allegations, he said, and his voice had the tone of someone executing a predetermined decision. Is actively combative. Uncontrollable. This is a liability situation. We cannot treat a patient who is actively making accusations of medical malpractice or negligence. Document that he's refusing care. He turned to the other physicians. We need to step back. One by one, they followed him toward the door like students leaving a classroom. 9 doctors. 8 doctors. 7. Their hands released their positions. Their eyes broke contact. The room emptied until Elena was alone with the commander and the monitors and the sound of her own hands keeping a man alive. His heart's not responding, the resident said, lingering in the doorway. His name was Chen. He was good. But he wasn't staying. Then we keep going, Elena said. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Her voice didn't shift. Didn't break. Get me another round of epinephrine. 1 milligram for push. Get me a crash cart. Full defibrillation setup. Sterling's voice cut through from the hallway like a knife. You're assuming full responsibility, Nurse Martinez. I'll make sure the board knows it. The door closed behind him. Elena was alone with a dying man and the silence that comes after everyone else has given up. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment when the commander's hand found her arm and held it like a man holding onto wreckage, and his eyes focused on hers with the terrible clarity of someone who was drowning and had just recognized the person in the water beside him as another drowning man who actually knew how to swim. Don't let me go, he whispered, and it wasn't a request. It was a command. Elena's hands kept moving. The trauma bay door swung shut and Elena was alone. 10 attending physicians had walked out. Every single one. Dr. Sterling leading them like they'd rehearsed it, his voice still echoing, too unstable. Too litigious. Not our patient anymore. The commander lay on the stretcher, eyes rolling back, his chest heaving in a pattern that meant only one thing. Tension pneumothorax. His right lung was collapsing under pressure that had nowhere to go. 2 nurses stood frozen by the supply cart. Young. Maybe 6 months into their careers. They looked at Elena the way drowning people look at lifeboats. She didn't hesitate. Didn't ask permission. The voice that came out of her mouth wasn't the deferential trauma nurse they'd seen for 3 months. It was someone else entirely. Someone with 17 years of muscle memory and 3 combat deployments folded into 2 words, move now. The younger nurse jumped. We need to call a doctor. Protocol says. Protocol is dead. Elena was already moving to the 4 station. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Epi, 1 milligram. Push it in 30 seconds. She didn't wait for confirmation. Her hands were already unwrapping sterile gloves, her mind running through the checklist that had saved lives in Kandahar while mortars fell outside the aid station. Pain is data. Panic is a choice. Move. The commander's oxygen saturation was dropping. 68. 65. The monitors screamed their electronic panic in a rhythm that meant death was 7 minutes away if she didn't do this right now. Elena's fingers found the anatomical landmarks on his chest like she'd done it 1,000 times. Because she had. Not in this hospital. Not wearing these scrubs. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was like opening a valve on a pressure tank. Immediate. Unmistakable. The sound of pressure releasing. The commander's chest expanded. The monitor's pitch changed. O2 saturation climbing. 70. 75. 82. His eyes cleared for a moment and locked on hers, recognition and something like gratitude flickering there before pain dragged him back under. Second chest tube, Elena said. Same side, fifth intercostal space. Anterior axillary line. Her hands were already preparing the equipment. The younger nurse was moving now, understanding that whatever protocol said, whatever Dr. Sterling's disappearing back had implied, this woman knew something they didn't. The older nurse was pulling supplies with the precision of someone who'd finally found someone to follow. The rhythm strip showed ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The worst rhythm of all. The heart wasn't pumping. It was just quivering like a fish on dry land. Elena was already positioning herself over his chest, hands interlaced, sternum a target she'd hit 1,000 times before. Manual defibrillation. The old way. The right way when you didn't have time for machines to think. She pushed down. Hard. The kind of hard that broke ribs sometimes. That was the price. 1, 2, 3. The compressions were like a conversation she was having with his heart. Start. Beating. Now. Charge the defibrillator to 200, she said. The pads were already on his chest, the younger nurse was learning fast. The machine hummed. Charged. Clear. His body convulsed. Once. The monitor showed the briefest flicker of organized rhythm before it slipped back into chaos. 4 minutes gone. 3 left. Elena didn't stop. Compressions again. Epi pushed for by the older nurse, who'd somehow understood without being told that they were running a combat protocol now, not a hospital code. The younger nurse was crying silently, her hands shaking as she prepared for the next shock, but she was still moving. Still working. That was enough. At minute 12 the rhythm began to stabilize. Not normal. Not yet. But it was trying. The electrical activity was finding a pattern. By minute 15 the monitors showed something almost like a heartbeat. Irregular. Weak. But present. At minute 17 the commander's heart found sinus rhythm on its own. Steady. Strong. The kind of rhythm that meant alive. The kind that meant Elena had just pulled someone back from the edge of a cliff in the middle of a Wednesday night while the hospital administration had already decided he wasn't worth saving. She stood back, her scrub soaked through with blood and sweat, her hands still trembling with the adrenaline of it. Not fear. Restraint. The trembling was her body trying to process what her mind had already moved past. She allowed herself one breath. 1 moment. Then, get him to ICU. Alert the surgical team. He's got injuries that need attention now that he's alive to survive them. The nurses moved like they'd been waiting for permission to believe in him again. Elena walked to the sink and washed her hands in water so hot it burned. She didn't look at her reflection. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd see. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part had already started. Dr. Sterling hadn't gone home after abandoning the trauma bay. Sterling had been busy. By the time Elena clocked out at 7 in the morning, her phone had already received a notification that her credentials audit was underway. Inconsistencies. That's what the email said. Inconsistencies in her nursing certifications. Her references. Her background. She knew what had happened. Sterling's network, board members who owed him favors, administrators who'd hired him 15 years ago, investigators who'd worked for his brother-in-law at the state medical board. One phone call from Sterling and suddenly Elena's sparse references were being contacted. Her credentials were being questioned. Her military service record, which she'd listed but not detailed, was being flagged as incomplete and suspicious. By 6 in the morning the hospital administrator had sent a summons to his office. Elena walked in expecting a conversation. What she got was a termination letter already signed by 3 board members. Effective immediately. Unauthorized procedures exceeding nursing scope of practice. Failure to follow chain of command. Disregard for hospital protocols. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic assassination. Every sentence was technically defensible. Every word was a knife. Your badge is being deactivated, the administrator said, not meeting her eyes. Security will collect your personal items from your locker. She nodded once. The same security guard who'd smiled at her every morning for 3 months stood in the hallway with a cardboard box. She followed him to her locker like a prisoner walking to processing. She knew exactly what would be inside. 3 photographs of Marcus in dress whites, face proud and alive. 2 pairs of spare scrubs. A protein bar she'd been saving for a bad shift. All of it went into the box. The guard's smile was gone now. He knew. Everyone knew. Sterling had made sure of that. By the time she left Sacred Heart, she'd passed at least 15 nurses who suddenly couldn't make eye contact. The message had been delivered in Sterling's language: this is what happens when you don't quit. The rain started around 6 in the evening, the kind of Denver rain that felt like the sky was crying instead of the person standing beneath it. Elena stood at Marcus's grave with the soggy cardboard box at her feet and allowed herself to fall apart in the only way she'd learned how, silently. The tears came, but her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. The words she spoke were the ones she'd tried never to say. I made it through Kandahar, Marcus. I made it through 3 tours. I made it through the mortars and the IEDs and the nights when we had no water and 17 soldiers depending on my hands to keep them breathing. She pressed her palm against the granite headstone, rain running down her wrist. But I can't make it through a hospital shift. I can't survive a man in a suit who's never risked anything. Her voice broke then, the first real break she'd allowed in 3 months. I failed you. I promised I'd never fail anyone again, and I failed everyone. The rain hammered down like it agreed. But 3 days later, everything changed. 3 days of rain had fallen on Denver. Elena hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night, sitting in her apartment with the cardboard box at her feet, the one containing everything that mattered: her scrubs, her badge, her identification. The hospital had been thorough. They'd erased her access codes, flagged her credentials in the State Nursing Board database, and filed a report claiming she'd performed procedures exceeding the scope of nursing practice. The words felt like bullets. She'd steadied her hands through mortar fire in Kandahar. A hospital termination shouldn't have broken her. But this wasn't just a job. This was anonymity ending. Then the phone call came. Not from the hospital. From federal law enforcement. A prisoner transfer was arriving at Sacred Heart that evening, a Taliban commander held at a detention facility in Colorado, requiring medical evaluation before transport to a federal facility. The call was routine notification. Elena almost hung up. Instead, she listened to the name. Her hands went cold. She didn't go to the hospital that night. She couldn't. But at 6:24 p.m., federal agents escorted the detainee through the emergency department entrance. Elena was there. She'd returned without permission, without a badge, standing in the corridor while security processed the transfer. Nobody stopped her. Nobody recognized her. She was just a woman in jeans and a jacket, watching federal officers move a shackled man toward the trauma-holding area. That's when the prisoner saw her. His eyes locked on hers and his entire body went rigid. The officers holding him tensed, hands moving toward restraints, interpreting the reaction as threat. But his voice when he spoke wasn't rage. It was recognition, and his words came in Pashto, a language that hadn't touched Elena's ears since Kandahar. The Angel of Kandahar. She pulled 17 of your soldiers from the rubble after our mortars hit. She wouldn't let them die. The Angel. The Angel. The officers didn't understand Pashto. But they understood the fervor, the desperation in his voice. One of them spoke into his radio. Within 30 seconds, the federal special agent in charge was standing 3 feet from Elena, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading classified intelligence. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just stood there while the prisoner continued shouting in Pashto, words about an American medic who'd worked without politics, without doctrine, who'd simply refused to let people die while others watched. The hospital administrator who'd fired her appeared in the corridor. Then the chief medical officer. Then nurses from the trauma bay. The prisoner's words echoed off the tile floor, bouncing off fluorescent lights like an accusation nobody could ignore. Elena could hear a monitor beeping somewhere deeper in the hospital. The sound felt distant, separated from this moment by more than distance. The Coast Guard commander she'd saved 3 days ago was in the hospital for follow-up imaging. The federal agent radioed his location. 2 minutes later, he appeared in the corridor, moving with the careful gait of a man still healing from a collapsed lung, bilateral chest tubes, and 17 minutes of manual defibrillation while 10 doctors had walked away. He was holding a file. His hands were shaking. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, he read aloud, his voice cracking on every syllable. The file contained her military records. Her classification status. Her service history spanning 12 years, 3 deployments, and enough commendations to fill a page. You saved my life. A Navy SEAL team leader appeared. Elena didn't know how he'd arrived so quickly. Later she'd learned the prisoner's outburst had triggered a federal notification system. When a Taliban commander identified an American combatant by her field name, it went up the chain in minutes. The SEAL was carrying official recognition documents, and his voice was steady as a sniper's breathing, Bronze Star with Valor. The room went dead silent. Purple Heart. Combat Action Ribbon. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Each decoration was its own sentence. Each one was a piece of identity Elena had spent 6 months erasing. Dr. Sterling stood at the edge of the corridor, watching his entire world collapse in real time. His face drained of color, not from respect, but from the realization that every call he'd made, every fabricated audit, every network he'd activated, had just been exposed in front of a federal agent, hospital administration, and a room full of witnesses. The woman he'd publicly mocked, publicly humiliated, the one he'd bet wouldn't last a week, she was decorated military. She'd saved a patient he'd abandoned. She'd done it alone. The federal agent turned to Sterling. You terminated this woman's employment. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The hospital board meets now, the administrator said quietly. All members. This session was just declared emergency status. The board convened within the hour in a room Sterling had dominated for 8 years. Elena sat outside in the hallway while voices rose behind closed doors. The commander was in there, describing his memories of Kandahar and the medic who'd refused to let him die. The SEAL team leader was in there, walking the board through her commendations. The federal special agent was in there, documenting Sterling's fabricated audit and fraudulent investigation. The prison transfer detail was still there, the prisoner still describing in Pashto, through a translator, how the Angel of Kandahar had treated the wounded without distinguishing uniform from blood type. Sterling had built an empire on his reputation. That reputation lasted exactly 2 hours. The board's decision came at 8:34 p.m. Dr. Sterling was terminated for gross misconduct, falsification of medical records, patient abandonment, and abuse of investigative authority. His medical license was flagged for board review. 3 board members whose careers he'd built on stood and voted unanimous against him. The consulting positions he'd held with private practices evaporated within minutes. Those firms couldn't afford the liability of association. That's when the security guard appeared. The same one who'd packed Elena's box 3 days ago, watching in silence as her locker was emptied into cardboard. He stood in Sterling's office door with an identical box, empty, waiting. His voice was steady as a nurse's pulse check. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling's hands shook as he packed his diploma, his awards, the photographs of himself with hospital donors and politicians. He walked through the lobby where staff members watched in silence. Elena stood by the windows in the main corridor, visible enough that Sterling would have to pass her. He couldn't meet her eyes. His jaw clenched as he moved past, and Elena watched him go with the same composure she'd held through every insult, every humiliation, every moment of his escalation. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply watched a man face consequence. Outside, news vans were pulling into the parking lot. The story of a decorated combat medic fired for saving a patient's life had reached the media within hours. Sterling's phone began buzzing with calls, interview requests, former colleagues asking for comment, his wife calling from home. Every door was closing. Within a week his medical license was placed under formal review. His prestigious consulting positions had evaporated entirely. The only job offer that came was from a community college 30 miles outside Denver, teaching CPR certification courses for minimum wage, working with teenagers who scrolled their phones while he demonstrated chest compressions on plastic dummies. 6 months later, Elena stood in her new office at Sacred Heart overlooking the trauma bay where she'd saved the commander's life. The nameplate on her door read, "Director, Trauma Training Program." She'd built a curriculum combining civilian emergency medicine with combat casualty care protocols, training that would save lives in mass casualty events, in disasters, in the moments when protocol met the absolute refusal to let someone die. The Coast Guard commander visited monthly for follow-up appointments, and he always stopped by her office. "Thank you," he'd say. Every time. "Thank you for staying." On the wall behind her desk hung a simple frame containing the faded Coast Guard unit patch she'd kept hidden in her jacket lining for 6 months. The insignia was worn from handling, the stitching careful and precise. Beneath the anchor, in thread that had faded to almost nothing, was the name markers. It was the only piece of her past she'd ever kept close. Now it hung in the light, displayed where anyone could see. Where everyone could know. A young nurse asked about the patch during Elena's final training session of the day. Elena touched it gently, her fingers remembering every stitch. "It belonged to someone who taught me that real strength isn't about power over others. It's about staying when everyone else walks away. It's about hands that refuse to stop working. It's about knowing that in the darkest moments, silence and composure are weapons more powerful than any weapon you could carry." As the sun set over Denver, casting the trauma bay in orange light, Elena whispered to the patch. "Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs." She smiled then, the first real smile in 6 months. Outside, Dr. Sterling was teaching CPR to a room full of teenagers who didn't recognize him, would never recognize him, would never know that he'd once tried to destroy a woman who was stronger than his entire network combined. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever faced someone who tried to use authority as a weapon, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment with your own story of standing when others walked away. We highlight the heroes no one sees. We always will.